Today's lecture is underwritten by the Dorothy M. Wissel Lectureship and the Joseph H. DeFries Memorial Lecture. Dorothy Wissel loved Chautauqua's intellectual advantages. Joseph DeFries was a committed Chautauquan and a scientist, and his family continues to spend time on the grounds. So please join me in thanking the Wissel and DeFries families for their continuing support as we thank all of you for your support of Chautauqua. Our guest this morning is Denise E. Zheng, Director and Senior Fellow of the Technology Policy Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In this capacity, she researches cyber and emerging technology issues. Prior to joining CSIS, Ms. Zheng served as Chief of Staff and Lead Technical Advisor as a contractor for the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency and their foundational cyber warfare program, Plan X. She has also served as Director for Global Government Relations and Cybersecurity Policy at CA Technologies. Additionally, she has served as a professional staff member for the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee and was a principal in the drafting and negotiations for cybersecurity legislation. Ms. Zheng has written on technology and cybersecurity issues, U.S.-China relations, and civil space policy issues for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and has appeared on CNN, BBC, CBS, and NPR. Ms. Zheng received her bachelor's degree from the University of Michigan and has studied at the London School of Economics and Political Science and completed graduate work at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. She's joined on her first visit to Chautauqua by Nathaniel Adler. Her lecture this morning is entitled The Future of Warfare in Cyberspace. So ladies and gentlemen, hackers and hacked, provokers and provoked, please join me in welcoming Denise Zheng to the Chautauqua platform.
Well, good morning, Chautauqua. Morning. Thank you so much for having me here. I am very delighted to be talking with you all this morning about cyber warfare, cyber conflict, and specifically the nature of cyber conflict in the past, the present, and into the future, and why cyber conflict is so difficult to manage. So, what does cyber war mean to you? There's a definitional problem when we talk about cyber war. Cyber war means many different things to many different people, and I believe that it's this lack of precision in how we use the term cyber war that contributes to our lack of understanding about how to deter it, how to manage it, and also how to leverage cyber capabilities for our own advantage. So I'd like to illustrate this by highlighting a few different incidents. In 2012, a group of Iranian hackers conducted a denial of service attack on the websites of JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, PNC. I assume that many of the folks in this room use one of those banks. For a period of time, people were not able to access their bank accounts through the website, but they could still use the ATMs, they could still go to the bank. Their money didn't disappear. There was obviously no physical damage. There was no casualties involved. So that's one incident in 2012. That was a really damaging incident, though. It opened our eyes to the types of attacks that could be conducted against financial institutions. In 2014, 2 years later, the North Koreans launched a cyber attack on the company Sony, the part of Sony that produces movies. And they exfiltrated emails of a number of Sony executives that were very embarrassing. I think one of them was about Angelina Jolie and how she's too entitled or something, and she's not getting paid enough or something like that. And they also stole a number of unreleased movies. So this was in response to Sony's refusal to abide by the North Korean government's demand that they pull the movie The Interview, which is a comedy starring Seth Rogen about the assassination of Kim Jong-un, the great leader of the supreme leader, they call him, of North Korea. In 2015, it was revealed that Chinese hackers broke into US government networks and stole the personal information of over 20 million federal government employees, myself included, that have a security clearance to access classified information. They stole sensitive information that we include in a questionnaire that all of us have to fill out about our personal relationships, our finances, potential drug use, health issues. This information has been used by the Chinese government to create a massive database to facilitate espionage activity. If they know who you are connected to, if they know what your weaknesses are, they can exploit them, potentially. So, at one point or another, the media, government officials, random people on Twitter, you name it, they've labeled these different attacks cyber warfare. But with all due respect, none of these incidents that I just described, even though they were disruptive and damaging, none of them qualify as an act of war. There was no catastrophic damage. There were no lives lost, no physical destruction. None of these incidents rise to the level of the threshold of war. And that is a feature that is sort of significant and common across all of the cyber attacks that we've seen to date, is that they kind of they're just shy of what is truly destructive and disruptive. No single incident has been damaging enough. And for that reason, we as a nation and many other countries have not fully mobilized our resources, our expertise to really tackle the issue of cyber war. But before we get deeper into this topic, I just want you to hang on to that thought for a moment as I tell you a little bit about myself, actually. So that's my office. That's where I work. This is where Sarah, Ladislaw, who you heard yesterday, Scott, Kath, John, all of the people that you heard in the morning sessions this week, this is where we work. At CSIS, the majority of the work that I do is focused on cybersecurity issues, cyber policy, surveillance, electronic surveillance, privacy, encryption, those types of things. Now, before CSIS, I worked at DARPA, as Shara mentioned. DARPA is the Advanced Research and Development branch of the military. And there I worked on cyber warfare programs, or you can call them cyber moonshot programs. Essentially, a moonshot program in technology refers to an ambitious sort of exploratory research project that's high risk. You don't know if it will achieve immediate benefits, but it's meant to be potentially revolutionary. By design, DARPA pursues high risk, high failure projects because we want to push the boundaries. I also worked at probably one of the largest software companies in the world that nobody's ever heard of, called Computer Associates, or CA Technologies, and really sort of developed an understanding of how private companies, software companies, technology companies in particular, design their products, how they ensure the security of their products, and the difficult balance of getting a product out to market, but that is secure. You want to be the first out with a new feature, the first out with a new product, a new service. And that sometimes does not lead to the most secure product, right? Before CSIS, DARPA, and CA, I was a staffer in the U.S. Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. That's their office. There are many offices in there. We had, part of that building. And I was the principal staff one of the principal staff in charge of drafting comprehensive cybersecurity legislation to secure our nation's critical infrastructure against cyber attacks. And by critical infrastructure, I'm referring to all sort of 16, 17 critical infrastructure sectors: transportation, the power grid, our health system, manufacturing. There are many of them. Defense industrial base. And this brings me to a story that I want to share with you. So just a few months after starting my job in the Senate, news broke of what was probably the most sophisticated and most damaging cyber attack that would fundamentally change the way that we think about cyber conflict. And this is the event that put the word cyber into the vocabulary of normal people around the world. And its disclosure of this incident launched the world into a global arms race to develop cyber warfare capabilities, a race between many countries around the world. And this was Stuxnet. How many folks here have heard of Stuxnet? A lot of folks. So in the summer of 2010, there was an emergency alert that the company Siemens, which is a German industrial engineering firm, they make industrial automation systems, programmable logic controllers, the small devices that you put in machines, into the power grid, into dams, into any type of factory or industrial process that's automated. They make the software and the equipment for those systems. They issued a warning to their entire client base saying that they had discovered a software vulnerability in their system that could be exploited, and issued some immediate sort of remediation information to vendors or to their clients. And when this happened, computer experts from around the world began to analyze the Stuxnet code. They dissected it. Literally people collaborating in the United States with Eastern Europeans, with people in Asia, all over the world, collaborating to better understand and review, thousands of lines of code to figure out what was the purpose of this malware, what types of systems did it target, what kind of damage could it cause? And people were shocked by the sophistication of it. It was incredibly well written by an expert, not only in hacking, but industrial control systems. This isn't your typical hacker. This isn't, your average teenager writing kiddie scripts in the basement. This is a really sophisticated entity that's conducting this attack, that's designed the Stuxnet code. And computer experts eventually realized, through dissecting the code, that this malware was specifically designed to sabotage centrifuges. And they knew this by looking at the serial numbers that were in the code. They referred to Siemens industrial control systems that were specifically designed to control centrifuges, and the code actually changed the frequency in which those centrifuges rotate. Simultaneously, not simultaneously, actually it was about 7 months before, the Iranian government agency that runs the country's nuclear facilities, and by the way, these nuclear facilities are, they call them civilian nuclear programs, but many, suspect that they are part of a nuclear weapons program. An Iranian government agency reported that engineers had discovered sophisticated malware in several of their industrial facilities. And so 7 months before the Siemens disclosure, in January 2010, inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency visited a uranium facility, an enrichment plant located in Natanz, Iran. It's in one of the most dry and arid parts of Iran, surrounded by mountains. And they noticed in January that the centrifuges used to enrich uranium at this facility were failing at an unprecedented rate. And the cause at that time was a mystery. Now, in the summer, as experts found Stuxnet, because Stuxnet had spread. It spread all around the world, and people were finding it on their home computers, they were finding it on their work computers, they were finding it in industrial facilities. Experts started putting the pieces together and realized that Stuxnet was likely the cause of the failure of the centrifuges in Iran. And unlike other malware, Stuxnet was much more sophisticated, as I mentioned. But what was important is that rather than exfiltrating data, right, or stealing information from them, which is what most cyber attacks do, it caused a physical effect. The destruction of equipment, physical equipment, by digital means. And Stuxnet was designed to spread because in Iran, the systems that are used to operate the centrifuges are in an air-gapped environment. That means it's not connected to the internet. Without an internet connection, it's really difficult to hack a computer when it's not connected to the internet. But the organizations that were responsible for designing Stuxnet were so sophisticated that they had programmed logic into Stuxnet so that it could operate autonomously and remotely on its own. It could be placed on a system, scan the system, figure out whether or not that particular system is the kind of target that it's looking for, and if not, it spreads from that system to another system that it's connected to. It's meant to spread and search for its target. And that's why Stuxnet spread outside of the Iranian nuclear facility and all around the world, and that's how we discovered it. So when my colleagues and I in the Senate that summer found out about this incident, we immediately rushed to convene meetings and briefings with officials from the Department of Homeland Security, from the intelligence community, to better understand the scope of the attack. Whether a similar type of attack could be conducted against the United States critical infrastructure. In particular, our own power grid. And we were also hoping to leverage this incident to push our legislation. We had drafted cybersecurity regulations which would have imposed new standards on the power grid, on other critical infrastructure systems. Their owners and operators would have to abide by certain security standards to make sure their systems were secure. We thought this was the perfect opportunity as the world is sort of grappling with what was going on with Stuxnet. Would we need to make changes to the bill to make it stronger, to address the specific vulnerabilities that were targeted by Stuxnet? These were some of the questions that we asked. And so we organized a staff delegation, a fact-finding trip to Idaho, of all places. Right, because of course that's where you go to learn more about cyber. Well, actually, Idaho Falls is, I don't know how many people live there, maybe a couple hundred. It is the location of a laboratory where the world's most preeminent experts on industrial control systems happen to work. They have an entire simulation of the electric power grid, and that's the facility. It looks kind of like the facility at Natanz, right? I mean, this is a very remote part of Idaho, surrounded by arid land, by mountains. And we traveled there from Washington. There's a tiny airport. It only opens for a couple hours a day. There's one restaurant in it. If you're lucky enough to be there when the chef is there, the cook, probably is a better word to describe it, is there. It doesn't have many flights coming in and out. We went there and we talked to some experts who dissected the Stuxnet code, and they could demonstrate its effect on a simulated environment of the US power grid to see what types of effects it would have on our own system, what kind of cascading effects could it have. We had in-depth discussions about what it meant for our own critical infrastructure. How do we get owners and operators of the power grid to secure against these types of threats, especially when they have limited budgets, right? A lot of our public utilities and power grid are owned and operated by state and local governments. And we specifically talked about sort of how do we make sure this never happens to us on American soil? Well, the irony was not entirely lost on us, of course. If the reporting is correct, and now I can't confirm or deny any classified information, but Stuxnet was a high-risk, covert operation that involved multiple countries, human agents, and sources on the ground in Iran, and it took a significant investment of time and money to conduct, and it was likely a US-led operation with assistance from Israel to disrupt the Iranian nuclear program. It demonstrated to the world that code could be weaponized to create physical damage. But most importantly, it shocked other countries. It shocked other countries that this type of capability existed and belonged to a potential adversary, the United States, right? It made them want to secure their own systems against this type of intrusion. And it also made them want to develop their own capabilities. They wanted that. So, like I mentioned earlier, it launched us into this sort of dynamic now in the global environment where many countries are investing hundreds of billions of dollars into acquiring cyber warfare capabilities. It also created competition within our own government because Stuxnet, as I mentioned, was a covert operation led by the intelligence community. And so it created internal competition within our own government between our intelligence community and the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense realized that the Stuxnet model is not scalable for cyber war. It was conducted under the US government's Title 50 legal authorities, which is the set of laws that govern our intelligence activities. It allows for much of the details about the operation to be secret. It allows for a higher degree of tolerance for risk. Military operations, on the other hand, are governed by Title 10 authorities, and it requires many more legal justifications. It requires transparency to some degree. We have more accountability measures built in for military operations. There's a duty, for example, to minimize collateral damage in military operations. Plans need to be rigorously war-gamed to ensure a degree of certainty in military operations. We don't have this equivalence in intelligence operations. And Stuxnet took years to develop and deploy. It cost perhaps tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, right? And we didn't know it was successful until we saw things in the news. Now, again, I am basing all of this off of publicly reported news, the New York Times and other news media. So I'm not sharing any information based on my own experience in the government. So these types of attacks are not easily repeatable, right? Stuxnet-like attacks are not easily repeatable. And the US government, particularly the military, knew that if they wanted to integrate cyber capabilities into military operations, that we would need to invest heavily in developing new technology, new capabilities, new doctrine for cyber war. And that leads me to my former employer. So one of the agencies that was tasked by the Pentagon to develop this new technology is DARPA. Originally, it was called ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, and then they added the D in front of it. But this was the agency, this agency was formed by President Eisenhower in 1956 after we saw the Soviets launch the Sputnik satellite. It was a shock to us, right, in the kind of way that maybe Stuxnet was a shock to many other countries. And so DARPA's mission from its inception is to pursue revolutionary technology to prevent strategic surprise. Sputnik was a strategic surprise to us. We had no idea that the Russians could do such a thing, right? And so DARPA pursues moonshot projects beyond immediate US military requirements to create our own form of strategic surprise for our own adversaries. And in the 1970s, DARPA invented what was the first iteration of the internet. At the time, they had no idea what the internet would become, obviously. They designed the network to facilitate communications between research universities on the East Coast with the West Coast. All of these universities have one thing in common. They're funded by the Department of Defense to conduct nuclear research. And they're using mainframe computers to do a lot of number crunching. And to facilitate collaboration and information sharing, DARPA designed a packet switching network so they could share that information. And so the picture on the top right is an old IBM computer that was originally part of ARPANET. That's what the internet used to be called. Today, DARPA is probably best known for its work on robotics. So the picture on the bottom left is a photograph of a woman. You may have seen this on 60 Minutes. This was maybe a year and a half ago. It's a fascinating story about a woman who's a quadriplegic. She spent the vast majority of her life as a normal, fully functioning person with kids, and she ran a successful small business, and suddenly, one day, she started to lose sensation in her limbs, and shortly thereafter, she became paralyzed from the neck down. And she struggled to find, meaning in this new way of life for herself, until she met researchers at DARPA who are running an experiment to create a brain interface for prosthetics. So literally, electrodes were inserted into her brain, which she can control using her own mind, using thoughts. A robotic arm that is not attached to her body, to pick up a piece of chocolate and feed it to her. You can watch this video, it's really incredible. This is the future. Right? This is a moonshot project that has delivered real results at DARPA. The picture on the right is a photograph of a Boston Dynamics robot, humanoid robot, that is designed to operate semi-autonomously. It was designed for a DARPA robotics competition focused on creating machines that you could send into a nuclear facility like the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster to actually disable a reactor into an environment that's unsafe for human beings. Now, as you can imagine, there are many warfighting applications of this type of robot as well. I don't want to scare you. This robot, if you just push it over a little bit, it'll actually fall down. It doesn't run very fast. It looks menacing. And I think it was probably designed to have sort of that appeal. But its capabilities are really rather minimal at this time. DARPA is also tasked with cyber warfare projects to solve some of the challenges that I talked about earlier, about resources, about the fact that it's hard to repeat these types of attacks, about how we don't have perfect information about the target. One project in particular is a project that I worked on called Plan X, and it was an end-to-end system that would enable military planners and operators to better understand the cyber battle space, right? So we have maps of physical terrain. You can go on Google Earth, Google Maps, and see really detailed imagery, right, from satellites. We don't have the equivalent for cyber. But there is a battle space, right? There are machines connected to each other. Affecting one machine can have cascading effects on the machines that are connected to it. So we need to better understand what this battle space looks like. How are devices connected to each other? What is the latency of communications between those machines, right? The program was also designed to automate a lot of aspects of cyber warfare, which is really tedious work. Who wants to sit behind a computer screen and look at millions of lines of code, right? It's not that fun. I mean, some people find it fun, but it's really tedious, complex work that you could task a machine to do, an artificially intelligent machine to do, at a much faster pace than you and with a higher degree of accuracy than humans. Right? And, if you think about cyber operations, especially if your target is not in the same time zone as you, if the target is on the other side of the country, you need to have computer operators working at all times of the day. Well, what if you could automate some of this stuff, right? So that during certain times of the day, the code goes out on its own and executes. Right? So in a lot of ways, cyber operations lend itself very well to automation, to artificial intelligence, and you can achieve massive scale by leveraging AI and autonomy. The other thing that we were trying to do was to make cyber warfare capabilities, and by warfare, I mean both defense as well as offense, right? To make it accessible to people. You have to train folks in computer code, in the systems, in intelligence, in military planning, right? It's a lot of training. And once you train that person up, they can easily find a job in the private sector working for a large bank and tripling their salary. Well, what if you could take somebody who wasn't a cyber expert, let's say somebody who grew up playing video games, right? Somebody who knows how to play video games using the Oculus Rift, which is a fully immersive virtual reality headset, and created a game-like interface so that conducting cyber warfare was almost like playing a game. That's kind of crazy, right? It's kind of crazy. I mean, that was sort of icing on the cake. If we got there with the program, then great, right? But it was really critical for getting support for the program, because it really connected with normal people. That there is no physical domain, there's no physical space to touch, to feel, to see cyber warfare, right, when you're operating in it. But if you could gamify it, it is like creating a physical environment for cyber war. Separately at DARPA, we also had a Cyber Grand Challenge, which was applying artificial intelligence to look for vulnerabilities in software, right? Vulnerabilities in software that could be patched. So basically, every device that you use, if it has a chip, a computer chip, and an internet connection, it's vulnerable. And we just don't have enough humans with the skills to look for all of the bugs in these systems and develop a patch for it. What if you could leverage a machine to do that instead? So we're working on that as well. But in actuality, I mean, that's the future, right? So that's like, I don't know how long out that is, but that is a distant reality. And that's the work of DARPA. Presently, cyber operations, hacking activity conducted by people that look more like this guy, right? The 400-pound hacker that then candidate Trump had talked about perhaps hacking the DNC. Well, this is a made-up Twitter account. I guess somebody had some fun. But really, you know, presently our cyber warriors are you know, it's a much more manual process, really. Now, in all seriousness, cyber warfare in the military context is a real thing. It really is. Military systems, our weapons platforms, nuclear command and control for space, sea, they're all digitally connected, making them vulnerable to cyber attack, right? And we are more connected than any other country. At the same time, our adversaries, their military systems are also connected. Exploiting these types of vulnerabilities give you some advantage in a military conflict. And so when people talk about cyber warfare, and that first slide I showed, which was sort of a digital rendition of a sort of an atom bomb plume or something like that, that's really not what cyber warfare looks like. When you talk to military leaders, it's about how to integrate cyber into traditional warfare, how to leverage intelligence collected using cyber means, how to exploit the vulnerabilities in the systems, the infrastructure that supports our adversaries' military systems to diminish confidence in the execution of their own military plans. That's what cyber warfare really is. And there are some features that I wanted to talk about that make cyber conflict really difficult to manage. And this is beyond warfare. This is including crime and espionage, hacktivism. There are probably more than these 4 features, but I think that these are the most significant. So 1, the internet is borderless. Information flows across borders for the most part without rules. There's one exception to this, and that's in China, where the Chinese have 3 choke points where all internet traffic coming in and out of China travel through these 3 choke points. And I can tell you that they monitor that traffic, they block that traffic, they know what's coming in and out, right? In China, people live in a surveillance state when it comes to internet activities, but not elsewhere in the world. In the United States, we don't have that. We have many connections. We don't really monitor them. We talk about that. Another feature of cyber conflict is that cyber attacks can be conducted remotely, at a distance, right? And you can achieve instantaneous effect. What this means is that there's a level of asymmetry in cyber conflict. Attackers have the advantage. You don't physically have to travel to your target, right? You don't actually need a ton of resources to buy a computer with an internet connection. And if you're really motivated and you don't think you can be caught, you can hack. You can hack computers all around the world. People do this. In some countries, you know, the government does not really prosecute cyber criminal activity. They don't have the capabilities to, or maybe they don't have the political will to do it. Those are some safe havens for a lot of cyber criminals. But there's asymmetry here also because you can buy really cheap cyber capabilities, malware, Trojans, denial of service attacks in the darknet. On the radio show this morning, I was talking about that a little bit. There are marketplaces in the darknet. These are not parts of the internet that you can access using Google. These are hidden parts that are encrypted, where you have to be trusted in order to be invited in, right? And in these parts of the internet, people are buying and selling stolen data and hacking services. For $20, I could rent a botnet to hack all of you guys for a couple hours. I can afford that. So there's this asymmetry, right? There's a low barrier to entry. And then another feature, perhaps the most important, is this feature of anonymity, which is related to the darknet, right? Because of encryption, because of the way that actually the internet is designed, the architecture of the internet, the protocols that are used, the internet was designed to be flexible, transparent, anonymous even. In fact, the military, this is kind of ironic, the military invested in Tor, which is basically the technology that is used to create the darknet. The military funded these things. Now, they funded Tor for secure communications for the Air Force, for the Navy, with the Pentagon, especially for forward deployed troops. This was many years ago. But eventually, malicious actors and other people adopted that technology, and they use it for other purposes. So there's this tension, and anonymity makes it really difficult to deter cyber attacks because we don't have a good way to attribute cyber attacks in a public way. And this brings us to the topic of deterrence. You'll notice in my work, it's really hard to find good images because everything's like wires and zeros and ones and code, and it's not that exciting. So you have to go online and buy these sort of silly photographs or pictures. But anyway, I think this displays to you what I mean, right? Deterrence is a strategic concept. You need strong attribution to deter an attack because you need to have a credible punishment. It's the only way to deter an actor if they believe that the punishment is going to be severe enough to hurt, right? And in some cases, you need international acceptance of your attribution so that you can justify retaliating to a cyber incident in the international community. This means that you need to provide evidence to support the attribution. But most of the methods that we use to attribute cyber attacks are classified. In fact, many of those capabilities are not based on computer forensics, but based on other sources of intelligence. We can't disclose those sources and methods. It makes attributing a cyber attack very difficult. So for example, when the Sony attack happened, our intelligence community came out, the administration came out and said, this is North Korea. Well, North Korea denied it, and many other experts came out and started looking at the incident and also questioning that attribution. It made responding to these types of attacks very difficult. It gives the adversary, the source of the attack, some plausible deniability. That's a problem for deterrence. Second, we also have to worry about escalation, right? So we don't have clear communications channels established for cyber warfare in part because a lot of this activity is shrouded in secrecy. We don't want to disclose the access that we have. So there's a significant amount of room to misinterpret or miscalculate who the damage, who caused the damage, what degree of damage was caused, who was the source of the attack. And because of that, we don't want to risk escalating the conflict to a level where we can't control it, right? So it makes deterrence very difficult. There are also some tactical aspects of cyber operations that make it unreliable and a really sort of fragile capability. So networks are constantly changing, right? You might be connected to the internet here at Chautauqua, and then you go home and you connect to a different network. These networks are dynamic. But if you think about, missiles and guns and other weapons, right? You point it at a target and you shoot, it will hit that target. You have confidence in it. In cyber, it's not the same. You can have a conventional military capability that just sits on the shelf, and you dust it off and use it when you need to, and you have a high degree of assurance that it's going to work. Cyber's not that way. You constantly have to groom this access. You have to monitor it. You have to see whether, and so this is very difficult to do. This is a sort of a tactical limitation. And so that's why cyber presently is much more attractive as a tool for espionage, to spy, to collect data, right? Because you don't necessarily need to deliver an effect with a high degree of confidence. You kind of cast a wide net and see what you collect. This is a picture of the National Security Agency located in Fort Meade, Maryland. I don't want to talk about what the NSA is doing because I'll get in trouble. So let's talk about China instead, because China does a lot of cyber spying. In fact, it's probably the most damaging sort of thing in cyberspace right now. Chinese economic espionage leveraging cyber means. So there's many specialized computer hacking divisions of the Chinese military that specialize in stealing sensitive intellectual property from technology firms, from defense companies, from energy companies, healthcare companies, all outside of China, of course. But unlike our intelligence agencies, which are spying or collecting data to provide a national security benefit or a political strategic benefit, the Chinese are spying for economic benefit, for commercial benefit, for that information to be then handed over to their own domestic companies so they can produce that product or learn from that intellectual property to improve on the product, sell it for a cheaper price. If you don't actually have to pay for the R&D, you can sell a product for a cheaper price and dominate the market. This map it depicts Chinese cyber espionage activity. Each dot represents incidents affecting companies or government agencies that involve Chinese cyber spying. This map is actually a few years old. It's probably more red now. But you'll notice that I think there's a dot in Idaho, just a single dot. That's where Idaho National Labs is located. Anyway, there is actually a direct correlation between Chinese industrial policy. So China has these 5-year plans. Their governance system has these 5-year strategies. And I'm sure Scott talked about this earlier this week, where basically the government comes with a plan about how they're going to grow a particular part of their economy or develop a new industrial capability. And what's really interesting is if you read this policy, it's a good signal for whether or not you're going to be hacked. So for a while, the Chinese, and they continue to be very focused on building a semiconductor industry. These are the silicon chips that are in all of your devices and computers. Well, a lot of American semiconductor firms got hacked, right? renewable energy. The Chinese want to be one of the leading providers of solar energy. Number of solar energy companies in the United States. Solar panel companies were hacked. Oil and gas refineries, same thing. Agricultural companies. So the Chinese are very concerned about their ability to continue to sort of feed a massive population, right? And they know that we have resilient sort of agricultural crops in the United States. They've been trying to steal information about how we've developed those crops. So the Chinese are probably the most active here. And this was the story of the day for years. Everybody was really focused on Chinese cyber espionage. How do we deter it? Until this guy showed up on the scene. This is Edward Snowden. And he blew the lid off of secret cyber espionage, electronic surveillance programs conducted by the NSA. Now, these programs are primarily focused on foreign intelligence collection, so collection of information about non-US entities. But there were also some parts of the disclosures that Snowden made that dealt with US persons and our metadata being collected, right? Because there are potentially terrorists, who are homegrown. And of course, there are criminals that we need to investigate domestically. And so this launched us into a global debate about privacy on the internet and whether or not it exists anymore. And it made Europe, our closest allies, very worried about US surveillance activity of Europeans. And it made Asian countries very worried about buying American products because they were worried that data about their citizens could be collected by US intelligence agencies. In the Middle East, even many of our allies in the Gulf are concerned about this, and we're thinking, do we want to continue to buy American products? It has had an impact on American firms that sell technology products globally. And it launched us into this debate about government surveillance and privacy and civil liberties online. It resulted eventually into the passage of the USA Freedom Act, which limited the ability of the NSA and the FBI to collect bulk information, metadata on US persons. And it incentivized a lot of tech companies, the companies that make your smartphones, to add strong encryption to text messaging services, so like iMessage, WhatsApp. Those messages now are impervious to FBI surveillance. In fact, even the company can't access that communication. It's made law enforcement much more difficult since companies adopted this. And it also put at risk the international trade of digital goods, threatening American companies, the pact that we had with European companies. So in Europe, you have a fundamental right to privacy, and the European Court of Justice ruled that US surveillance programs, that the continued offering of American technology products, email services, messaging services in Europe, cloud services in Europe, right, is a violation of fundamental human rights of Europeans, because that data could be collected by the US government. And so they tried to restrict those companies and their ability to sell in Europe. They restricted the flow of data across our borders. This has had an impact on our economy. We've negotiated a deal to give them some assurances that we do protect that information, that we don't surveil indiscriminately. But that deal is very fragile. And then, of course, with China, they are legitimately concerned that Chinese citizens buying American products could be surveilled by American companies or the American government. And so they've started to impose many restrictions. No personal data can leave China now. But the interesting part about China is that there is this legitimate concern about security and surveillance, but the Chinese are also leveraging it to grow their domestic tech industry. They have the largest market for technology in the world just by selling to themselves. They would much rather Chinese firms buy from Chinese firms than from American companies, right? Transporting that wealth outside of China. This runs against free trade. So cyber isn't just about warfare in the military context, it's also about espionage, and it's also about global commerce. And that's how conflict is playing out. So what do we need to do about this? Well, there's a lot of different things we need to do, and I think we need to think about these different types of activity as sort of almost distinct things: espionage, warfare, crime, trade, sort of as distinct things, because the response is very different in each case. For warfare, we need better attribution tools. We need to share intelligence. We need to share that intelligence with private companies. This applies to cybercrime as well. We need to build up our law enforcement capabilities at the FBI, the Secret Service, state and local law enforcement agencies to conduct cyber investigations, to prosecute cyber criminals. We need to train and equip our workforce. There's about 2 million unfilled jobs in cybersecurity. Not because people aren't interested in the jobs, but because they don't have the skills to take those jobs, right? The jobs crisis in the cyber realm isn't a shortage of people, or jobs actually, it's a shortage of people and skills, with the skills. And the government is probably feeling this the most, right? The NSA trains, the FBI and the NSA and other parts of the government train many young people in computer security. And as soon as they're trained, they get hired by companies who can triple their pay. They can't maintain this pipeline. They can't afford it. And finally, we need to think about how to respond to nation-state hacking, because I think it's going to get much worse. Right, so we talked about some significant incidents, but there have been recent developments that are concerning, extremely concerning. One being that now nation-states are getting into hacking our financial systems. And when you combine a nation-state who has no regard for international norms, who's run by a relatively crazy person, you can cause severe damage. In fact, right now the North Koreans are hacking banks around the world as a form of income for the government. Isn't that crazy? The North Koreans are relatively detached from global commerce. What do they care if our stock market crashes? Great, right? How do we deter a rogue state that has nothing to lose? They're so disconnected. We need to figure out how to deal with this. We also need to think about an issue that's very timely right now, and that is our electoral system. And I want to end on this topic because I think, what we talked about is cyber war, conflict, espionage. In a lot of ways, it touches the individual, the average person, but it also doesn't. It's kind of happening between nation states, between hacktivist groups. There's not that much that people can really do about it, other than learn about it and try to protect themselves. But this is an exception, our electoral system, right? So it was reported, many, even Trump administration officials have confirmed that I believe 21 states, their electoral systems have been probed by the Russians. And some systems were hacked and data was actually stolen. This is a threat to our democracy, right? And there is something you can do about this. So the organizations that are in charge of securing our electoral systems are state and local governments. They don't have the sophistication and the expertise. And in many cases, they're worried about the federal government providing the resources and the expertise to secure these systems because of states' rights. So you as citizens need to hold them accountable. You need to ask them, what are you doing to protect these systems? What are you doing to uncover the vulnerabilities? What are you doing to ensure that my vote is secure, right? So contact your local officials, learn more about this, ask the right questions, and hold them accountable. And with that, I'd like to take some questions.
Excuse me, you know how to ask questions, give them to your ushers, or tweet them to CHQ 2017. You smiled when you said we don't really monitor our internet connections. Do you want to explain that a little bit more fully?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, sure. So, like I said, our intelligence agencies conduct foreign intelligence collection, and they monitor traffic for foreign intelligence purposes. And as part of that traffic, there is commingling of U.S. persons' information and communications, as well as foreign communications. So you have to figure out how to separate those things, and sometimes the separation can get kind of messy, right? I guess that's what I mean. And then, of course, we have domestic law enforcement agencies that do conduct domestic surveillance when they have a search warrant. And so they need to have the capability built into some of these networks to conduct a lawful wiretap. And so some of these capabilities do exist. And as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, applications like iMessage or WhatsApp are making that lawful intercept impossible, even when law enforcement has a warrant based on probable cause to collect that information.
Are we as a country transparent with Canada in cyberspace?
Transparent? I think much more so with Canada than with many other countries. So there's something called the Five Eyes, and this is a group of like-minded nations, our closest allies that we share more intelligence with and do things in coordination with. Canada is one of those countries, and so they are a very close ally. Australia is another one of them. The UK is also part of the Five Eyes. So yes, we are not completely transparent, absolutely not, but we do share a lot more with them, and they share with us.
How successful is our private sector in thwarting Chinese and other economic spying?
It depends on which part of the private sector you're talking about and in what time period. So maybe 5 years ago, they were really not so good at, figuring out if they had been attacked and what information has been lost. They've gotten much better at it because this has become sort of an international issue that we've developed some norms around. JP Morgan Chase, for example, spends $500 million a year on cybersecurity alone to prevent against some of these types of attacks. It's a lot of money. Money can buy good technology, right? So the private sector has gotten much better. They've gotten significantly better, but it's the most largest, well-resourced companies that can pay for better security. Small, medium-sized businesses, they're still extremely porous.
What qualifications are needed to be allowed on the dark net?
Oh, qualifications. Well, it depends on which part of the dark net you want to engage in. So you could actually go home, open up your computer, and download a Tor plugin into your web browser and go onto the darknet. But the most interesting parts of the darknet are closed. So you may get onto the darknet, but you're not going to be invited to the interesting forums, to the interesting marketplaces. In some of these marketplaces, you actually have to demonstrate your street cred as a criminal. So you have to say, here's data that I stole, and here are some notable incidents that I was responsible for. Here's some vulnerabilities that I researched. Let me in, right? Or in child pornography rings, you actually have to share original pornographic material to get invited to join some of these things. I mean, I don't want to go there, but, anyone can get on the darknet, but to get into the most sort of elite circles of the darknet, you have to prove yourself. So the qualifications are, how good of a criminal are you?
A question from Twitter. Do you share the concern of Elon Musk, Stephen Hawking, and others about artificial intelligence?
Yeah, I do. In fact, I have a presentation on AI that I've been giving lately about whether machines that are super intelligent someday, whether they're benevolent or malevolent, right? Are they going to be like C-3PO, or are they going to be like Terminator's T-1000, right? And we don't know. But what should really worry you is that even C-3PO can be unintentionally malicious, right? So what happens if you design machines that are not designed with malicious intent, right? But they haven't been programmed to have compassion or to value human life, right? And it's that disregard, the lack of those principles that should be built into those machines that could have negative effects, negative consequences on society. So this is kind of theoretical, but maybe we can touch on it a little bit during the master class.
We have several questions about Iran, North Korea, China, Russia, and probably the one that sums this up. What's the right framework needed to let our enemies know that cumulative cyber attacks will constitute an act of war?
I'm not sure I agree with that statement. Because cumulatively, we've suffered significantly from cyber attacks. It's cost our economy, the global economy, trillions of dollars in damages, but we haven't retaliated in any really meaningful, significant way involving conventional military capabilities. This is the sort of million-dollar question. What is the appropriate response? When you look at the responses that we've had so far, we are very hesitant to strike back in a strong way. And there's good reason for that, because we don't want to escalate the conflict. And we also don't want to normalize that type of response, because, we talk about being the target of attacks, but we're also the most advanced in our capabilities to conduct attacks, right? So there's this tricky balance that you have to weigh, the costs and benefits of establishing a clear response to something that isn't quite that damaging yet.
And I don't want to try to interpret, but again, all of these questions are about retaliation, about our response. Another question is our retaliation an act of cyber war, and are we prepared? Again, a lot of these questions come to that.
Are we prepared for cyber war? We are more prepared than many other countries. But no, we're not prepared yet. And we don't have yet the technology to conduct cyber warfare with real confidence. And we don't have the defenses either to secure our systems against cyber attack fully. So it's like nuclear weapons, right? If you develop the capability to create catastrophic damage, you better be prepared for when that damage happens to you, unless you can deter. with mutually sort of assured destruction. But I don't know that you can have a mad type of dynamic in cyber war. It's just not the same. Nuclear weapons cause your face to melt, and nuclear fallout for thousands of years or more. Cyber's just not like that. There are a lot of smart people trying to figure this out.
A couple of questions about our own devices. One is, do you have any rules of thumb for comparing devices that we buy to determine how secure they are? And another direction you can go on that is, should we just go back to paper ballots?
Yeah, that's great. So part of the reason why the OPM hack happened and it was successful is because all of that data was digitized. If it was paper form, the Chinese could not have stolen all of that sensitive information about people with clearances, right? So yeah, I mean, if you really want to protect something, you might, perhaps the most secure way the best way to secure it is to not put it on a computer if it's really sensitive. But there are things that you can do. Surely there are things that you can do. So I'm a huge fan of Google, but Android phones are more vulnerable than Apple phones. And generally speaking, Microsoft operating systems, because of the open design of a lot of these systems, are more vulnerable than Macintosh operating systems. There's also smaller user base. So there's some product differentiation, and you as a consumer should research that, right? You should create market demand for more secure products. That's how you get companies to change the way that they develop products and services, to compete on security, right? There are things that you can do. So we talk about changing passwords. We talked about that last night at a dinner I attended. But maybe rather than changing your password, just get a password manager. It's an app that generates your password for you, and it generates a sequence of completely nonsense symbols and numbers and letters. The app memorizes it, and you authenticate into that app with your thumbprint, right? That's easier on you as a consumer. You don't have to memorize a bunch of different passwords. Get one of those, or use two-factor authentication. Operate and assume as if your data has already been lost or can be lost. So don't put anything sensitive into emails, right? Don't share your bank account information. Pretty simple tactics.
I can't decide on one of these for the last question, so I'm going to ask them both. They're not really related. One is, can compassion be built into cyber technology? And the other is, you said ask the right questions to your local government officials. What are the right questions?
I knew I was going to get that one. Can we build compassion into our cyber systems? Yeah, I believe we can. And there are many researchers, especially, there's a team at MIT, in the MIT Media Lab, that's dedicated to doing this, how to build machines with compassion for human life, to value human life. In fact, this debate is playing out in self-driving cars, right? Do we design cars to prioritize the life of the people inside the vehicle, or to prioritize the life of the people who are crossing the street? Do you consider health and age and the number of people? Are machines going to be altruistic? These are things, and this is scary, that Congress is going to have to weigh in on and decide for us, right? So you should participate in this conversation. That's a real conversation you need to engage in. In terms of hacking our political system or our election systems, write to your local state and local elected officials. Ask them what they're doing. Go to town halls. Challenge them on these questions. These are elected officials. Hold them accountable with your vote, even. Make them feel like this is something that really matters. And, donate to campaigns that prioritize this. Money always elevates the priority of things.
I did notice on your map that China is watching Chautauqua, so I'll leave that as the last word, and we will thank Denise Zheng for a very interesting talk.